Okay, well, let's go ahead and begin. Our speaker today is the Reverend Dr. Carlos Emilio Ham, a pastor of the Presbyterian-Reformed Church in Cuba, served as its general secretary from 1993 to 2001. In March 2001, he joined the staff of the World Council of Churches as program executive for Evangelism and Diakonia Regional Relations, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and served that role until 2013. He is currently the president at Matanzas, Evangelical Theological Seminary in Cuba. And with that, Carlos, I turn it over to you, sir.
Thank you. Greetings, warm greetings, everyone. I have to say, I know it for you, most of you is good afternoon. For us, it's good morning since it's 9 o'clock over here. Warm greetings from our seminary, the Ecumenical Theological Seminary in Matanzas, which was founded in 1946. And we are based in the city of Matanzas, which, as I told Tom, we are 100 kilometers east Havana. I will begin by sharing a PowerPoint. Here we go. Things are working out well. Great. Can everybody see it?
Yes.
Are we okay? Can you hear me? Perfect.
Yeah, we can hear you good.
Perfect. I see I have a sign here saying that my internet connection is unstable. So let's see how things evolve.
Yes.
Well, just to mention that because of the US embargo, we are not supposed to use Zoom. We do not have direct access to Zoom. So therefore, we have to use other electronic resources, which sometimes makes the connection a bit slower, but I hope that everything is going to work out fine. So as Dean Tom mentioned, the title of the lecture today is going to be Missional Formation, an essential component of ecumenical theological education. First of all, I'm very grateful to my sister Marina and to Professor Tom for your kind invitation to share this presentation on behalf of our seminary. We will be focusing mainly on these two parts, these two sections. First of all, we will try to define theology from our perspective, on the one hand. Secondly, theological education. And thirdly, how missional formation is being carried out in our seminary. And then in a second part, we are going to share some critical remarks regarding mission in general and missional formation in particular, based on a book written by our brother Matthias Preisberg, who is a Swiss brother that have been working in Latin America, particularly in Bolivia, for many years. And he published a few years ago this book that translated into English is Intercultural Contract, Crisis and Refoundation of Theological Education. There I'm looking at the section of mission, and I have highlighted there some points. So here we go. How do we understand theology? According to Professor Sergio Arce, who was the president of our seminary during the time I studied, he served between 1969 and 74. Actually, I graduated on the same year in which he concluded his tenure. He says, and I quote, "The theological endeavor is a task of the church, in the church, and for the church. It is a communitarian task through which the church self-analyzes itself. It analyzes itself. I'm trying to translate the original in Spanish. Objectively and scientifically, the evangelical message, or the message of the gospel, rather, I think we should rather say, no, the message of the gospel of faith, hope, and love, that at a given specific moment in human history and geography, the church communicates to its world." So therefore, here we see again, let's say, that critical dialogue, so to say, between our biblical faith vis-a-vis the context in which we are serving. So the reflection on that, the communication of that to the world, is what we understand as theology. Where, on the other hand, theological education, for theological education, I would like to share with you the declaration of identity of our seminary. Let me say, first of all, that the term evangelical might be a bit misleading in English, because evangelical for us in Cuba and in Spanish is synonymous of Protestant. So it's not that we are an evangelical seminary, excuse me, in the sense of understood in English, evangelicals, like, for example, Pentecostals, but rather Protestant. And quite often we replace the E of evangelical with E of ecumenical, because we have in Cuba around 15 theological seminaries historically established, and all of them, except ours here in Matanzas, are denominational. That means that each church is responsible for forming its new pastors and its new lay leadership from a rather, I would say, a rather denominationalist and sometimes even sectarian approach. Whereas our seminary is the only ecumenical one, since we have the church, the seminary is run by 4 churches in its board, and we have had students and professors from more than 30 Protestant denominations. And we are even ecumenical in the wider sense, to the extent that we are even interreligious. We have, one of our programs is called the ISECRE, Ecumenical Institute of Higher Science, Education of Sciences of Religion, where we have students and professors from different religions, and even agnostics and atheists and all type of things. So just for you to know a little bit the characteristics of our seminary, which helps us to understand a bit better our declaration of identity. We say that our seminary is a Christian academic community working on pastoral formation, as well as training in areas of Bible, theology, and sciences of religions, with an ecumenical. Again, the word ecumenical, the concept, the vision of ecumenical is critical for us. Contextual, inclusive, and liberating vision at the service of the churches in Cuba, and we also say in other countries, since we have had also throughout all our 76 years of existence, both students and professors from other countries. So then in the following slides, I will reaffirm the importance of missional formation as an essential component of this ecumenical theological education. And I would like to anchor my presentation quoting the definition of mission of the World Council of Churches' Commission on World Mission and Evangelism in its document published in year 2000 called Mission and Evangelism in Unity Today. And I think it's very helpful because it helps us to understand what do we refer by mission when this term has been used in such a different, and I would even say antagonic ways by different church families. So the document says, and I quote, "Mission carries a holistic understanding. It is the proclamation and sharing of the good news of the gospel by word," and then we have a number of Greek terms here, kerygma, deed, diakonia, prayer and worship, liturgia, and the everyday witness of the Christian life, martyria, teaching. They do not use the word didache, which I'm going to introduce in a few minutes, but didache as a building up and strengthening people in their relationship with God and with each other. I think this is all about theological training for mission, is precisely strengthening our relationship with God, with our people, with each other, towards healing and wholeness in reconciliation into koinonia, communion with God in a rather vertical way, communion with our people in a horizontal way, but also with creation as a whole. Further down, the Mission and Evangelism Unity in Today document defines evangelism, saying that while it is not excluded from the different dimensions of mission, it focuses on the explicit and intentional voicing of the gospel, including the invitation to personal conversion, to a new life in Christ, and to discipleship. So missional formation has to do, in other words, with capacity building in order to carry out the Missio Dei, God's mission. In other words, missional formation is the process by which we develop and strengthen the skills, instincts, abilities, processes, and resources in order to fulfill God's holistic mission more resourcefully in today's world. So as an example, I am going to apply these Greek words that I mentioned before, words and concepts, to theological education from our own Latin American and Caribbean perspective. So the first notion that is mentioned in this document is kerygma. Kerygma is a Greek word, again, which means proclamation. It may refer to the content of the gospel, to the message of the sermon, or to preaching itself. So preaching is one aspect of proclamation. proclamation of the good news of the gospel can take different expressions, different ways. Preaching, let's say, from the pulpit, one way of proclamation. So the verb form querizo, meaning to preach, excuse me, to proclaim, is used in reference to Jesus's message concerning the coming of the kingdom of God. Excuse me. In the current New Testament scholarship, the term kerygma is used to describe the content of the early Christian message. So it's important when we talk about kerygma to go back to the origins of the term and to the Christian community. It contains within its scope the life and work of Jesus, with a particular emphasis on his conflicts, suffering, death, and resurrection from the dead. In addition, the kerygma connected the events of Jesus' life and death with the history of Israel, seeing them as the climax of God's redemptive activity. So it is certainly true that in the minds of the New Testament authors, there is no separation between the kerygmatic proclamation, which is to a certain extent a redundance, from Jesus of Nazareth, who lived, preached, died, and rose from the dead. He indeed was the one who was alive in the world of preaching. And we were reminded of this a few days ago when we commemorated Holy Week and Easter Sunday. Secondly, capacity building for sharing the good news of the gospel through or by diakonia. Diakonia is the church's vocation to serve, expressed through diversity of gifts. It takes shape through the participatory, committed, and prophetic process of transformation and empowerment of men and women. In other words, of the whole church. We believe that diakonia is not reserved just for deacons and deaconesses, but rather diakonia is about sharing the good news through the different gifts by the whole church towards human dignity, justice, peace, and integrity of creation. It contributes to the multiple efforts of those who are committed to improving the quality of life for all. It is an essential part of mission, or rather, we should rather say, perhaps even better, commission of the whole church to be faithful participants in God's mission. And this paragraph is a quote of the area of diakonia of the Cuban Council of Churches. This is the way in which the Cuban Council of Churches defines diakonia, which of course we subscribe to. And I will share with you 4 moments of diaconal mission here in Cuba. As an example, firstly, Protestantism was founded in Cuba in the 19th century by those that are known as so-called missionary patriots. and they served and they founded Protestant churches from the around the last 20 years of the 19th century. These were lay people who fought against the Spanish colony. They had to flee the country because they were persecuted politically. They were converted to Christianity according to the Protestant tradition in the U.S., mainly in the Florida area and in the southern part of the country. And they returned to Cuba while they were struggling against Spanish colony. They were also founding Protestant churches. And it's interesting that many of these churches that were founded, in each congregation that was founded, there was a small school that was also established, particular for those poor people, poor children that whose parents could not afford to pay for education. So we see from the very beginning of the Protestant presence in Cuba, it is through God's mission carried out by diaconia and by service. Then in 1901, the US missionaries came. Some of them, they even neglected and denied that history. That's why some Protestant churches that were founded initially in the 19th century, some of them count their history beginning in the 20th century after the US missionaries came. In these first 50 years, or rather 60 years, no, 50 years of the 20th century, many sanctuaries were built with American dollars. And most of these churches were built together with schools, clinics, pharmacies, etc., for to help the people, no? And on the 1st of January of 1959, the Cuban Revolution triumphed, and 2 years after, 1961, just before the invasion of the Bay of Pigs, the socialist character of the revolution was declared, and what the revolutionary government did was to intervene, to nationalize all the private schools. So therefore, all the church schools that belonged to the churches were nationalized and taken over by the state. That means that in the first 30 years of the revolution, 1960s, 70s, and 80s, we could not, let's say, carry out a diaconal mission towards the wider community because of the very strong atheism of state that we had at that time. At that time, no churches were closed, even when the schools were nationalized, no churches were closed. But pretty much we had to carry out our mission, and inverted commas, confined to the four walls of the sanctuary. Excuse me. We could not carry out a mission towards the streets. No. All of this changed 180 degrees when the Berlin Wall collapsed in 1989. The Soviet Union was dissolved, and all the Eastern European Communist bloc was dissolved, and therefore we adopted a secular constitution, and the Marxist state, even it is still called Marxist, it is no longer atheist, and therefore the churches and religions in general not only are allowed to carry out diakonia in our society, but is also even expected. I mean, we're going through a very, 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 very critical economic situation in Cuba now as a result of the US embargo, as a result of the COVID, as a result also of our own shortcomings and mistakes, because it's not fair to blame international factors of our problems. And therefore, the state is even expecting for the churches to carry out diaconal mission. Now, how does this inform theological education? In different ways. When I studied here in the seminary in the 1980s, again, I was formed as a pastor to a model of church that was confined to the four walls of the sanctuary. So the training that I received was to preach from the pulpit, carry out Bible studies, and if I had some social involvement, it was to visit the members of our churches. So I was also trained for pastor counseling. Now, the type of theologians and pastors that we are forming today are for a different type of church that is called to serve, to carry out God's mission through diakonia in the wider society. One of the things that I have discovered is, particularly when I was working with the World Council of Churches in the area of ecumenical theological education, is that to a certain degree, many of our theological seminaries are very good in in biblical sciences. We teach our students how to do exegesis and hermeneutics of the Bible. But what I believe it's missing to a great extent is to have the scientific tools in order to do exegesis and hermeneutics of the context in which we are carrying out God's mission. So it's exegesis and hermeneutics of the biblical text on the one hand, and of the context on the other. And in that critical interaction between both is where theology emerges, is where theological training, education, formation emerges, precisely to carry out God's mission in a particular place. I am inspired always by this quote that you see there from Leslie Newbigin, which I know many of you are familiar with, who served from the UK, but served as a bishop in India, and also was the director of the Commission on World Mission and Evangelism of the World Council of Churches that I'm quoting in this document. Leslie Newbigin said, the church should not be an institution. I underscore the prefix institution, but rather an expedition. I underscore the prefix ex there. So, end of quote. So theological education has shifted in Cuba pretty much from being carried out for a rather institutional church, and in inverted commas, when I say institutional, I'm referring to this, to the fact that the church was confined to its own institution. And the main challenge for us as a theological institution now is how can we form new expeditionaries, theological expeditionaries. That is, theologians, pastors, lay leaders that are carrying out their mission, or rather God's mission, towards the society. Thirdly, the third Greek word, very important for capacity building for God's mission is liturgia. Liturgy comes from the etymology, or the origin of liturgy comes from the 19th century, both from French and late Latin and Greek liturgia, which means public service. This is why quite often the Sunday worship, it's called also Sunday service, no? Worshiping, it meant worshiping the gods, worshiping of the gods. The liturgos is a minister, laicos public, ergos is working. So it's interesting that this term liturgy is a combination of laos, people, and ergos, working. So here is where this concept, which you find in the following paragraph, bolded, very important, the concept of liturgy after the liturgy, which is a very rich theological concept that comes from our from our Orthodox brothers and sisters. Excuse me, meaning that liturgical experience is not limited to the Sunday 1 hour worship in the sanctuary, but rather liturgy is carried out throughout the 7 days of the week. So when we participate in the liturgy, Sunday's liturgy in church, for example, when we participate in the sacrament of Holy Communion, when we take that bread, the body of Christ, when we take that wine, the blood of Christ, we are nourishing our spirits in order to go out to the world, to work for a more just society, to work for a society in which everybody can enjoy the daily bread that we mention in our prayer, no, the Lord's Prayer, no. Fourth term important to carry out God's mission is marturia. Marturia means to bear witness, to testify, and it's mentioned 34 times in the New Testament. And it's interesting because when I was raised in Cuba during the first 30 years of the revolution, during the times of atheism that I mentioned, we were strongly discriminated. No? As a young Christian, I could not study any career that would have an impact in the, let's say, ideology of the people. I could not study journalism, foreign affairs, psychology, because I was not trustworthy. No, so we kept on saying in our meetings, for example, of the student Christian movement, of our all of our young people's meeting in our churches, we mentioned quite often that we carried out God's mission as marturia. Marturia, not only in terms of sacrifice, and thank God we never had in Cuba martyrs because of our faith, as it happened in Eastern European countries in the Soviet Union. But we carried out marturia in the sense of bearing witness. We had to bear witness of our faith, of the good news of the gospel, through our action. They said quite often, look, this young Christian, such a good student, it is a pity it is a pity that he or she is a Christian or is a religious person without realizing that if she or he was a good student, a good citizen, was precisely as a result of being Christian. And it's very important, according to the New Testament theology, the fact of witnessing to the truth. So when I read, preparing myself for this lecture, when I read about witnessing to the truth, rapidly it came to my mind all the fake news that is developed in the digital social media. No, it's amazing how so many lies are portrayed in the media. So I think theological education towards a missional formation, towards martyria, is precisely to build capacity in order that we can bear witness to the truth. And according to the Gospel of John, who is the truth? No, Jesus Christ Himself was the truth, the way, and the light, whom we proclaim. Number 5, didache. I need to move a bit quicker. I'm conscious of the time. I'm looking at my clock, at my watch. Sorry. Fifthly, capacity building for sharing the good news of the gospel by didache. Didache means teaching. So when we talk about theological education, it is about didache. No? And one meaning of the word didache in the early Jewish Christian community, there was this document called the Teaching of the Apostles, or in a rather lengthy way, the teaching of the Lord through the 12 apostles to the Gentiles. So kerygma, proclamation, is often distinguished by didache in the sense that kerygma is the message of God's acts in Christ, calling people to the decision of faith and membership in the community of faith, the church, whereas didache is the instruction in belief and morals the new converts received within the church. So when we work as a seminary with the churches to strengthen capacity towards Christian education, we are trying to be faithful of this Greek term didache, so important from the very beginning of the early Christian community. 6, capacity building for sharing the good news by Evangelion. So evangelism, as we saw in the mission and evangelism in unity today, evangelism is an essential aspect of the Missional Day, oftentimes neglected and even misunderstood. For example, here in Cuba, through the different economic crisis that we have gone through, and like the one we're going through right now, very, very severe. Some churches try to proselytize, meaning try to condition conversion to the giving out of food, medicines, toiletry, etc. Can we really call that evangelism? Is that really sharing the good news of the gospel? Rather, authentic, responsible evangelism points to the unequivocal and purposeful communication of the good news encouraging conversion as a process of transformation, following the footsteps of Jesus Christ, encouraging an encounter, personal encounter, and communitarian encounter with Jesus Christ. According to Emilio Castro, who has been the only Latin American General Secretary of the World Council of Churches, a Methodist pastor from Uruguay, who before becoming a General Secretary, he was the Evangelism Secretary of the World Council of Churches. He says, and I'm going to quote him in this dictionary, the Ecumenical Movement, Evangelism entry, I quote, the dimension of evangelism is fundamental to the ecumenical calling. Clarity in confessing Jesus Christ as God and Savior and calling others to faith, and Christian discipleship is the guarantee of Christian authenticity and ecumenical work. The only valid theological method for evangelism is the conscious participation in the whole human life and its problems. For the great mass of people, evangelism is a question not of apologetics, as many churches believe, but of life. What Gustavo Gutierrez, as you know, one of the founders of Theology of Liberation, has said about Latin America, that the people are poor and believing, applies to the vast deprived masses throughout the world. The discussion is about explaining the faith in terms of joy, faithfulness, justice, and solidarity. End of quote. And finally, capacity building for sharing the good news of the gospel towards koinonia. Koinonia is one of the most beautiful words, Greek New Testament terms, since it means community. It points to a theological education which, according to our understanding, should be ecumenical. But ecumenical not only in the sense of interdenominational unity, not only in terms of interreligious relationships. I mentioned at the beginning this program that we have of our seminary, ISECRE, is the Higher Ecumenical Institute of Sciences of Religion. But community in the wider sense, ecumenical in the wider sense, beyond even the interreligious dialogue and relationships. In times in which, both in Cuba and also globally, there's an increasing tendency towards denominationalism, sectarism, even fundamentalism, conservatism among their churches and their training processes. So, and this, of course, takes expression in their own theological education practices and understandings. Furthermore, koinonia seeks to live out the values of God's reign. As the World Council of Churches Faith and Order, Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry document says, I quote, the church as koinonia is called to share not only in the suffering of its own community, but also to share in the suffering of all by advocacy and care for the poor, the needy, and the marginalized. By joining in the efforts for justice and peace, within human societies by exercising and promoting responsible stewardship of creation and by keeping alive hope in the heart of humanity. End of quote. So koinonia, beyond the narrow boundaries of a particular congregation, is the result and ultimate goal of holistic mission, which marks the presence of the church in the world. The Missio Dei, God's mission, is called, therefore, to build an inclusive and just community, an oikos, a household in which the oikumene, the entire creation, is included, enjoying fullness of life intended for all. This is a quote from Philip Potter, another former General Secretary of the World Council of Churches, the only Caribbean General Secretary from Dominica. He has, this is my favorite quote of ecumenism. He says, the ecumenical movement is about working with God in such a way that the whole inhabited world, the oikumene, where we all live, can become an oikos, a home in which everybody is embraced, everybody is included, enjoying dignity, justice, enjoying fullness of life intended by God through Jesus Christ, not only for Christians, but also for whole creation. So some concluding remarks in the rather 10 minutes remaining that I have. I am sorry, don't worry, I didn't run away. This is an excellent book. I'm sorry, it is in Spanish. The title is Contrato Intercultural, Crisis y Refundación de la Educación Teológica. Translated into English is Intercultural Contract, Crisis and Refoundation of Theological Education. Matthias, as I said at the beginning, is a Swiss missiologist and theological educator who has lived and worked for many years in Latin America, particularly in Bolivia. It's a very interesting, critical, thick book. It has 400 plus pages. No, there he has a section on mission and how he understands mission should be present in the theological education endeavor. So I will conclude my lecture quoting some of his remarks. He believes, Matthias believes, that the definitions and practices of mission have to a great extent an ecclesiocentric tendency. That is a tendency, it is too churchy, so to say. So mission is conceived as fruit or action of the church, when historically and biblically, the relationship is the opposite. The church rises from the mission of Jesus and of the apostles. Secondly, mission should be rethought as Missio Dei. This means that it's important to decentralize the church's mission. In the Missio Dei, the priority is to establish, or should be, to establish the kingdom of God, of which the church is sacrament and mediation, not exclusive representative. So then, missional formation, from the perspective of theological education, has to do in carrying out responsibly the Missio Dei, which is to proclaim, not the church. It's interesting, the French Roman Catholic priest Alfred Loisy from the 19th and 20th century, he has this famous quote when he said, Christ preached the kingdom, and what came was the church. To meaning that the church has become an end in itself. And when we proclaim the church and we try to proselytize those to produce more Presbyterians or Methodists or Catholics or Baptists, we think we're doing mission. It's the opposite. Responsible missional formation has to do with a missional training that has to do with the proclamation of the values of God's kingdom, that according to Romans 14:17, it is a matter of justice, peace, and joy in the Holy Spirit. These are the values of the kingdom that we are called to proclaim through the Mission Day. See, the discourses and the missionary practices are pretty much marked by the goal of converting souls and to plant churches. Many conservative churches, this is their understanding of mission in general and evangelism in particular, to convert souls, to save souls, and to plant churches. The missionary practices and discourses have a more pastoral and instrumental approach, is another criticism of Matthias. He says that sometimes we have too much a pastoral and an instrumental approach rather than a theological one. The missionary practices and discourses, he says, they relate more to ways of communicating the gospel than the attempts to discern and to update its contents. So theological education towards missional formation should lead us precisely to further deepening and strengthening attempts for spiritual discernment and update of the contents in each one of the contexts in which we are living. More recently in Latin America, particularly among the Evangelicals and Pentecostals, the need to highlight holistic mission, this is a very important concept here, in Spanish, misión integral, seems to be quite, I would say, progressive, and it actually is compared to what I described before, because it tries to enhance the missionary practice to the fields of diakonia, health, education, social engagement, defense of human rights, and rights of all nature. But on the other hand, Matthias says, and this is his criticism, there is a need to further stress the resistance to political, religious, moral, sexist powers that tend to become absolute, to participate in alternative social practices which lead to more equity, justice, peace, nonviolence, and preservation of creation. So it's not only a matter of feeding those that are hungry, but also to go to the root causes of why we have so much hunger in the world, which is increasing, as we know, as a result of the pandemic. Don Helder Câmara from Brazil, a Roman Catholic Archbishop, he said, when I feed the poor, they call me saint. But when I ask, why are they poor? They call me communist. So these are the critical questions for theological missional formation. No, critical questions is why. So one of the main challenges of mission is the willingness also to be transformed by the other. I like this notion a lot. We believe that we as missionaries, we have all the truth, we have excuse me, we are in possession of the good news, and we share that, and we have nothing to learn from others. And he says, quite rightly so, I believe, that when we carry out God's mission, we have to be transformed by the other, both in capital letter, the other meaning God, the other in low O, the other is our human fellows, no? Particularly from an intercultural perspective. That is precisely one of the main emphasis of his book, theological formation from an intercultural perspective. And finally, I'm ending my time, but also my presentation. This is the final slide. Two final points. It's striking that in general, in the historical ecumenical theological formation institutions, the subjects of mission and missiology have disappeared from its curriculum. I know a number of theological ecumenical institutions in which mission is no longer relevant. I remember when I worked in the mission and evangelism team in the World Council of Churches, we had to struggle to keep the flame of mission, of Missio Dei alive, because other agendas like justice, peace, integrity of creation, faith and order, etc., were higher in the ecumenical agenda. So when the preparation for serving, and I underscore this, I think this is the main idea I want to share. When the preparation for serving the reign in capital, that means God's reign, is a chief goal in theological education, missiology becomes central and pivotal for the theological education. Yep. Nevertheless, in this context, this is Matthias again, he says that oftentimes this missiology plays a role to justify the colonial thinking, as well as the imposition of foreign mindsets, instead of developing its own local missiology and missionary action. So my conviction is that theological education for missional formation should encourage the local theology, the indigenous theology, according to the needs of the context where Missio Dei is carried out. And final point, theological education is called to put itself at the service of mission that comes from outside itself and from outside the churches, as mentioned before. It neither owns it, nor controls it, nor directs it, rather it serves it. So thank you very much. I'm laughing because I think it's the first time that I'm giving a whole hour for a lecture. Normally I have to cut and cut and cut because of the time, and I have used exactly the hour that very graciously you have given me. So let's try to.
There you go, Carlos. You're fine.
Here we go.
Here we go. You are spot on. And I want to encourage anybody who has any responses or questions to go down to the bottom, and there's a reactions button, and you raise hand like that, and you can see the hand coming up on the Oxford Center for Mission Studies. And that way I can recognize any questions from those who've joined on Zoom. Anyone here can raise their hand to me, and I will have them ask them. I will start off, but Carlos, thank you for a good lecture, and especially in this whole idea of theological formation and missiological formation. How do you actually go about that at your seminary in Cuba? What are some of the things that you're training your seminarians as they're coming up to embody this and to carry it forward in terms of their life and work in holistic mission?
Thank you, Tom, for your question. Do you want me to answer now or to take other questions or?
Go ahead and answer, and then we'll just go to the next one.
Okay, thank you. Well, I tried to explain that when I said that, for example, in 60 years of revolution, Marxist revolution in Cuba, the first 30 years were of the churches confined to the four walls of the sanctuary. At that time, I studied in seminary. I studied in the 1980s for a model of church that again was confined to the four walls of the sanctuary. After the Berlin Wall collapsed, and in the final 30 years, the second half of the history of the Cuban Revolution, atheism is no longer a state policy. We adopted a secular constitution, and therefore the churches are not only allowed, but are expected by the state, by the civil society, to carry out its mission of sharing the good news of the gospel, as I explained before, through all these different functions, no? Through diakonia, through marturia, through didache, through liturgia, etc. No? So obviously, we pursue missional formation for a type of church that is quite different than the one when I studied. Mm-hmm. So I tried to explain that we are not limiting the study of biblical sciences as we used to do when I studied biblical sciences, but also we are in our missional formation, we're trying to carry out other social sciences, no, in order to carry out the good news of the gospel in a more relevant way in our society today. Mm-hmm. So there is, well, and I can give you two more examples. We had for many years our mission and evangelism subject. It was shifted, and now it's called Mission and Diakonia department. No, that means that when diakonia was hardly mentioned in the first 30 years of the revolution, diakonia is one of the main purposes of mission today in our country. The other thing is the schools for diakonia. We have already, for 10 years already, we are carrying out these schools for diakonia where we bring people from different parts of the country. It is carried out with the Cuban Council of Churches and the Martin Luther King Center, where we provide, I can share with you the curricula of these schools, in which again we try to form the new theologians, the new pastors, the new lay people in the techniques of diakonia.
Good.
Which when I grew up in our society, in our Cuban Revolution, completely atheist, that is something that I never learned to do.
Yeah. Good. Any questions from those of you out there who are listening in? Any here? Oh yes. Come up here and ask your question. And introduce yourself too. And where you're from.
Thank you, Dr. Carlos. I am Wendimu, coming from Ethiopia. Maybe slightly different context from where you are in terms of providing theological education. I really appreciate your approach using the fundamental terminologies from which the concept of theological stems. So I am very happy on your approach. What I have been wondering is particularly that wondering is related with my context, because from where I come, theological education the church is providing under liberal government leadership system, where there is no connection between theological institutions and universities. So my question is related with how you developed the curriculum, particularly as we are using the concept of diakonia, extending to address, different aspects of theological education, where you raise the example of science and other, subjects being provided as part of the curriculum. So there is the issue of integration and also functionality that comes along that. So how do you integrate the curriculum, and how do you really reach those people? You said even atheists are joining your seminary. So with this big idea of Missio Dei, taking the step of God and trying to reveal the glory of God to these atheists within the seminary context. So I see two kind of curriculum, two kind of subjects, philosophies, all those are under interplay. So as a seminary leader and professor, how do you integrate the curriculum, and how do you see its functionality? I think if I get something on that, it would be very much beneficial in my context. Thank you.
Thank you, my brother, for your question. As I saw you and as I heard you, fond memories came back when I visited your beautiful country while I was working in the World Council of Churches. Precisely, we organized a seminar for Africa on diakonia, on ecumenical diakonia, and it was quite a rich experience. Oh yes, let me tell you, you are right. Even when our both contexts, Ethiopia and Cuba, are very different, one of the things that we have in common is what you described, the complete separation between theological institutions and the universities. We have exactly the same thing. All at the beginning, I said in my presentation that all schools were nationalized by the state, but that was not the case of the seminaries. All the theological seminaries, we kept our independence, and we were entitled, and we have been entitled always to teach whatever we believe is important for the church's mission. In spite of that, in spite of the fact that we're completely separated, seminaries, theological institutions, and universities, we have and this is answering your question, very important collaboration with professors of the universities. Because as I said before, it is important theological education in the context of multi-scientific approaches. Because again, if we want to do exegesis and hermeneutics of the context in which we're living, in order to carry out God's mission in a more relevant way, we have to use social sciences, and for that we have to rely upon specialists in different disciplines of social sciences like economics, psychology, sociology, no? And we invite them to our seminary, particular to this other program that we have that I mentioned, the SECRE, the interreligious program. of sciences of religion, where they come and teach all the different sciences. And there we have, let's say, a cross-fertilization, very rich between theological inputs and scientific inputs. We still do not have, I would say, official, let's say, contracts between the seminary and the universities, no? But we certainly invite these university professors in order to come and to teach. And that, of course, has an impact in our curriculum, which was your other question, no? Our curriculum on missional formation, it covers all these different disciplines with specialists in all these different areas. If we believe in holistic mission, we have to carry out missional formation, which covers all these disciplines. Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon. This is Nidia Garcia. Saludos, hermano.
¿Qué tal? Qué bueno escuchar el español.
Buenas tardes, buenos días. I'm a student in OCMS. This is my second year, and I'm researching generosity and stewardship in the context of Latin America, the Evangelical Church. And I was very much enjoying all the approaches and invitation to redefine and reframe many of our approaches in our churches. One of the reasons I'm researching generosity and stewardship in the context of Latin America is because as the church has come to understand or experience an invitation to participate with God in his mission, some parts of the church are not understanding how to support families and missionaries that want to serve. And so I see there's a disconnect between an eagerness to participate and in the same way, a response to help. And so where would you put in the terms that you have described, where would you put stewardship, generosity as foundational for holistic mission or missional thinking? Thank you.
Gracias, Nivia. ¿De dónde tú eres? Where are you from? What Latin America country?
Gracias, sí, hermano. De México.
De México. Okay, mucho gusto. Nice to meet you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you for your question, Nivia, in an excellent English.
Thank you.
Yes, I think that generosity and stewardship would fall basically under the whole question of, well, on the one hand, I would say liturgy. I think that liturgy should be a space or a moment or an activity, not only where we work on our spirituality, but also on our rationality. And I wish that through our liturgical life, we could continue to develop generosity and stewardship. For example, you have there for the offerings, for example, within the liturgy. I think we need to stress the importance of responsible stewardship that is not limited to the offering of our money, but also the offering of our lives, in life sacrifice for the Missional Day, I think it would fall there. And to be generous, not in the sense of putting in the offering plate a lot of money, but to be generous as we look at the other areas of responsible stewardship, which is how do I use my gifts, the gifts that God has given me? How do I invest in my time? How do I invest in my material resources? So I think liturgy, and then the whole concept of liturgy after the liturgy is important. And of course, the whole question of koinonia, no? As I mentioned before, the ultimate goal of Missio Dei, koinonia, is to form community, no? I think that if we work towards a community as described in the early Christian community in the book of Acts, where those that are mostly in need are served and are supported by those that have more possibilities, I think we are both generous and we are sharing our stewardship. And I wish you all the best in your research, because I think that we need, particularly in a post-COVID situation, I think we need more of generosity and stewardship when there's a tendency of more grief in our world today. Thank you.
Michael, will you unmute and ask your question?
Thank you, Tom. Carlos, thank you very much for this lecture, which was a substantial piece. And I would just like to highlight one line of your thought, which I found intriguing, and that is the criticism that mission may be, in some cases, too much concerned about people and not about theology. So if I got that right, my question would be, what has become of all these kind of points where theology engaged with ideologies like Marxism? In the 70s and 80s, we had a long debate about that. I mean, you are still living in a Marxist country. So where are the chances for your church, for your seminary to engage also in this theological debates with what we would call the secular sciences, the ideologies, the philosophies of the time? Because I feel that maybe sometimes under, how would a good word be in English? It's not really well lighted and pointed out in our approach to mission. We think we are talking about diakonia. We think about approaching people to offer them salvation or whatever what we believe in. But what's the approach in theology? What do we offer them maybe as a kind of an approach in mission, in a theology, in a theological way to explain the world, to talk about God in the world and things like that? So I was intrigued by this line of thought in your lecture and would like to hear a little bit more about that. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. I'm trying to find the quote because I don't remember mentioning that that mission is not about people. No.
No, you did not say that, but I heard you saying that Matthias Preisberg was making that we are sometimes too much concerned about approaching people and less about theology. So it's more about services and less about theology.
Yes.
That is what I was picking up.
Yes, but thank you. I mean, I think so. I think many of the conservative and fundamentalist churches, of course they approach people, but what for? Is it for conversion? It is for proselytism? I think as it was for Jesus, the human being was in the center of the ministry of Jesus Christ, no? So I think it's critical and obvious that for us, the center of our mission should be the human being, but with the purpose of working and struggling towards fullness of life for the human being, and not only for human being, but also for the whole creation. No? When he says that we have to look more at theological approaches. What I understand about that, and I agree with that approach, is that we need, again, when I say that we need to use social sciences, and you mentioned yourself, Michael, when we use social sciences of an instruments of analysis of the context in which we are living, and of course that includes Marxism as well, when we look at economy and we seek for economic justice for all, this interrelationship between our biblical faith and social sciences, this is what provides us, let's say, the discernment, the necessary spiritual discernment in order to approach the human being, not for conversion of their souls, but to approach human being to seek fullness of life for that human being in the context of the community. And here is where, again, koinonia is important. So I think the critical thing there is how in our theological education, what is our process of discernment, and how do we become relevant in the context in which we are, first of all, teaching and sharing, and also secondly, when we are carrying out God's mission in our respective societies.
Israel, go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Hola Carlos, un gusto conocerte. Yo soy peruano, soy de Lima.
Mucho gusto, Israel.
¿Qué tal, Carlos? Okay, thank you very much for the lecture, and I think you have touched so different areas of this holistic mission thought, and the context you describe in Cuba, I think it's a bit similar in the rest of Latin America, where we have, in a way, create a very big distance between the way how we live as a church and the context surround us, to, in a way, to work this distance, to become closer with this idea of building up God's kingdom in our midst. It is the vision, the wish, what we want to do, and I find in the way practical challenges to do that. And what you talk about the theological seminaries or schools by themselves, and the educational system on the other side. And I heard someone from Cuba actually saying that they have a problem to interact because they don't have this entrance in the university environment of Cuba. And will you say that and the reason why these seminaries couldn't be accepted or looked upon like real faculties of higher education is because we don't have teachers with accreditation. And in Peru, we cannot have a faculty now because we don't have theologians with university accreditation, nationals. So will you say that one way to overcome the gap and to interact with our environment will be that, could be one possibility, one way of overcoming this, to have faculties of theology that could interact with the other faculties of sociology, like you were saying, anthropology, humanities. Will that be real to think about it?
Thank you. Thank you, Brother Israel. Thank you for your question. And thank you for being there from the very beginning. When we start 1 hour and a half ago, I saw that you were already very disciplinedly sitting there in front of your screen and your and your camera. Thank you for mentioning the whole question of accreditation, because as soon as you were speaking and raising your question, I was thinking about that. One of the dilemmas and challenges that we face in theological education in Cuba today, remember, we have separation, complete separation between state and churches, and therefore complete separation between theological institutions, educations, and the state and universities. And the state by no means interferes with our curriculum, with what we teach and how we teach, by no ways, no, by no way. But at the same time, the Ministry of Higher Education does not recognize our accreditation, our titles, our diplomas, because we do not follow their own requirements. We have had a lot of discussions throughout many years with Ministry of Higher Education to try to find ways in which they can accredit our titles and our diplomas. And we keep on getting a whole list of requirements that are important for them, but does not have anything to do with the objective of our theological institution, which is, as I said at the very beginning in the declaration of identity of our seminary, it is to provide capacity building for the churches to carry out their mission in today's Cuba. So then we find ourselves in a dilemma between meeting the requirements of the Ministry of Higher Education on the one hand, or meeting the requirements of the churches on the other. And of course, our final decision is, well, we are here to serve the churches, even when we have to sacrifice our accreditation. The other interesting part is that our sister theological faculties in other countries, North America, Latin America, the Caribbean, in Europe, they accept our degrees. they accept our degrees, but the Cuban state, the Cuban Ministry of Higher Education does not accept our degrees. So again, this is a situation, and I know that this is also an issue in other Latin American countries, the whole issue of accreditation for a similar situation, even when they are not living in a socialist or a Marxist environment. But we, as I said before, we invite professors to teach here. We have some of our professors have been accredited by the Ministry of Higher Education, and they're teaching there in some universities. So we do not lose the hope that the Ministry of Higher Education at some point will accredit our diplomas and degrees, and we will finally, let's say, officialize an agreement between our both institutions. I see the final hand of my sister Esther, and it's already 1 hour and a half.
We'll let Esther ask the last question. Esther, if you're there, go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Thank you so much, my brother, for that illuminating lecture and for the challenge it brings to many of us within theological education. I was intrigued when you said that mission and missiology has disappeared from the curriculum. So I have to go and check whether we still have it in my own curriculum. I want to just find out what impact this approach has had on the churches, particularly those that you call Protestants, or here we call them mainline churches or missionary churches, in terms of attracting young people and retaining them, but also in terms of offering conducive working spaces for women.
Thank you, my sister Esther. Even when I cannot see you because I think your camera is off, I have fond memories of visiting. Thank you. I have fond memories of visiting St. Paul's University in Limuru, in Kenya. Thank you. Yes. No, I think that in terms of your first point, I know many seminaries, so-called historical and ecumenical seminaries that have mission included in its curriculum, but others that are more advanced, they focus more, as I said, in the World Council of Churches, they focus more on the so-called justice, peace, and integrity agenda. No? And mission and evangelism is more carried out by the so-called evangelical churches as seminary. But there are other seminaries like the University of St. Paul, our seminary in Matanzas, that carry out mission studies and mission curricula as well. The interesting thing there, I think, also is to see what is our understanding of mission, which is our missiology that informs the way in which we carry out God's mission. Secondly, the impact of our churches, I think, well, we have a long way to go, but I think that the churches appreciate the way in which we try to train our new pastors, not only as pastors conceived traditionally as the the main subject in the congregation, but rather as communitarian facilitators, no? That those that exit our seminary, they go out with a better preparation, understanding mission more holistically, no? Mission that is understood as sharing the good news of the gospel through service, through liturgy, through proclamation, no? Through teaching, through didache, no? So I think that the other area that I think that is important to explore again, in our brothers Michael Bill there from EMW, who I see his face there still. His office is pretty much supportive of that type of exchange, not only supporting theological education, but also exchanges among theological institutions. We appreciate very much, and I hope we can continue to strengthening our relationships between theological institutions, not only with universities locally, but also with theological institutions and universities and other theological institutions broadly, particularly in the global South. So through flights is very expensive, but I think we could pursue more through Zoom, this type of exchanges. I want to thank again the OCMS for the invitation, for this initiative of these lectures. I think that it helps us precisely in this direction to strengthen our relationships and to learn better from each other. So thank you once again. God bless you, and we look forward to other lectures on Tuesdays.
Yes, well, thank you, Carlos, and we much appreciate your talk today. Thank you.
Thank you.
One of those phases, Michael Schmidt will be next week. So, Mikael, we look forward to hearing you next Tuesday. And
I'm
so,
excited.
blessings upon you all, and have a wonderful day. Adios.
Thank you. God bless you all. And thank you
Bye.
once again.